WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in on Memorial Day. Later in the show, we'll re-air some recent segments that we think you'll enjoy or find relevant to this holiday this year. But we'll start with something brand new for today with our friend, the historian Kenneth C. Davis. It's a 2026 look at what this Memorial Day holiday is about and where it came from. Of course, it's the unofficial start of the summer season, but for anyone who has lost family members or friends in war, it is a day for remembering their sacrifice, of course, on behalf of all of us. Traditionally, it's to honor members of the armed forces who have died in battle. I always also think of it as to honor the civilians who've been killed by whatever nation's armies are fighting each other. And can we even be sad for service members from enemy armies killed in war? Is that a step too far? Even if the wars were just, even if killing them was in self-defense, those individuals, they are also human beings who in most cases lost their lives by physical conflict when their leaders couldn't settle things peacefully. And of course, this year has been no exception. To talk about the history and meaning of Memorial Day, we're joined once again by historian Kenneth C. Davis. Ken, despite knowing a lot about history, is the author of the Don't Know Much About History series of books, and most recently, The World in Books, 52 Works of Great Short Nonfiction. Welcome back, Ken. Thanks for joining us for a little Memorial Day 101.
Good morning, Brian. It's always a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Maybe everybody knows this, and it's a weird place to start, but Veterans Day, November 11th, is to honor the living. Memorial Day is to honor the dead. And maybe it's a distinction worth reminding people of out loud. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely, because I'm asked that all the time. What's the difference between Memorial Day and Veterans Day? Because we seem to be honoring veterans on both days. Veterans Day was, of course, born out of World War I, the day of the armistice that ended World War I, the Great War as it was then known, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It later became a day to honor veterans of living and dead of all America's wars. Memorial Day is specifically meant to honor those who died in service to the country, as you mentioned, and we can certainly broaden that definition out. But that's where it began, to honor those who gave what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion.
And Memorial Day was originally May 30th, and it became one of those holidays moved to the nearby Monday. Veterans Day remains November 11th, no matter what day of the week. I guess it's because of what you just said. It commemorated the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, in particular, ending World War I, right?
Well, yes, and it had been changed to one of the Monday holidays, which happened in 1968 under what was called the Uniform Holidays Act, which also moved Washington's birthday, which is now mistakenly called President's Day. It's still officially Washington's birthday, and Memorial Day. Veterans Day, because of the strength of veterans groups, was then moved back to its original November 11th date. There was an attempt to move Memorial Day back to its traditional date, which was May 30th, and that failed. So it does unfortunately strike most Americans as the beginning of the summer, the first full 3-day weekend of the summer and time for the swimsuit sales. Unfortunately, that's not the meaning of the holiday at all. It is the most somber day on our national calendar.
And Memorial Day's origins go back to the Civil War, that war in particular. How did it get started?
This is interesting, Brian, because it started out as a day called Decoration Day. semi-officially announced in 1868 by a man named John Logan, who was a general during the Civil War. He was a congressman as well from Illinois, and he was also the leader of a fraternal group called the Grand Army of the Republic, the equivalent of it in its day of, I suppose, the American Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Very powerful political fraternal organization. And in 1868, Logan announced in what he called General Orders Number 11 that this day should be set aside as a day to go and decorate the graves of the fallen soldiers, those who had given their lives to the Union to preserve the Union. Hence, it was called from that moment on Decoration Day. It only gradually became known as Memorial Day, and it was set on the first one was on May 30th, 1868. Not an official federal holiday in any respect, but certainly celebrated widely throughout the former North, the Union. And it was not seen in the same light at all in the former Confederate states, which began to mark their own separate decoration days or Memorial Days because they didn't want to honor what they thought of as a Union holiday. So this, from the very beginning, had a very, very deep partisan divide, and that lasted a long time.
Does that linger at all today? Are there decoration days or Memorial Days that, of course, aren't federal holidays, but are broadly in any way observed in the former Confederate states?
Absolutely. There are still Confederate decoration days in, I think, 7 states. I'm not sure which they are. And, of course, some of those, because we've had this movement, we went through the period of removing Confederate statues from federal places, renaming Army bases that had been named for Confederate generals, which now the current administration is reversing and finding names of obscure people who had the same name as the Confederate general that was once honored. So we're going through, I think, a bit of that reaction moment right now with respect to how we view the Civil War, how we view slavery in American history, and it's an important time to reflect that Decoration Day began in the North, in the words of General Logan, to honor the soldiers who gave their lives as a reveille to freedom to a race in chains. So we can't separate out the element of slavery and the Civil War when we look back at the history of this holiday. And that's why it was very bitter for a long time. There are records, for instance, of Confederate families being kept out of Arlington Cemetery on Decoration Day because this was seen as a day to honor the Union dead. And there are, of course, several or more than several Confederate soldiers interred at Arlington Cemetery.
We're talking about Memorial Day on this Memorial Day with historian Kenneth C. Davis, author of the Don't Know Much About History series of books and other things. So let's talk about some of the places and ways that Memorial Day is observed. You mentioned the Arlington National Cemetery, the largest U.S. military cemetery, which is a center for this holiday. What do they do there?
Well, one of the most moving things is something called Flags In, and I believe it's called the Third Army, spends a couple of days before Memorial Day, which is now, of course, on a Monday, placing a flag on each of the grave sites in Arlington. And many communities around the country do the same thing in other respects and often call on local civic groups to come out, either the Boy Scouts or the American Legion, to mark those graves of those who served and gave their lives in service to the country. I was recently up in Maine and was interested to come across the grave site of a man who had served in the Revolution as a teenager, and I found his little grave site by a roadside, and it had been marked by one of the local veterans groups, even though he hadn't actually died in the war. But it was still this idea of those who gave service to the country.
Yeah, and Arlington gets all the press, but there's at least one national cemetery here in New York City. I have a late relative who served in World War II and was eventually buried at the Cypress Hills National Cemetery, which is on the border of Brooklyn and Queens. So it's not just Arlington.
No, it's not just Arlington. And I believe Arlington is, of course, the most famous, but I believe the largest is actually the Veterans Cemetery that's on Long Island. And I'm sure some caller is going to check us on that. But I'm pretty sure the Long Island Veterans Cemetery is now actually the largest veterans cemetery in the country. And, of course, there's Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is perhaps alongside Arlington another vestige of the Civil War. Of course, Lincoln went there in November of 1863, a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. And, of course, he was there to dedicate a cemetery to those who had fallen in service to the country. And it's there, of course, that he gave the Gettysburg Address, which to me is still the most meaningful way to understand what this holiday is about.
Talk about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's another phrase that a lot of people have heard of, for sure, but may not really know what it is.
That's a good one because it also relates to the way that Veterans Memorial Day, Decoration Day came back into the public consciousness. By the turn of the 20th century, Memorial Day or Decoration Day had really become a picnic holiday. People had forgotten the Civil War, 30, 40 years later, even 50 years later. And it had, even though they went to the cemetery to decorate the graves with fresh flowers, as they were supposed to do, it had really become still more of a summer picnic holiday. And it's the losses in World War I that reminded the whole country of the loss that the country had experienced not only in the Civil War, but in all of its wars. And it was that moment that really propelled the recognition of Memorial Day as more of a national holiday, even though it didn't really become a national holiday until quite a bit later. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was created in Arlington Cemetery with the idea that one unidentified remains should represent all those who were unidentified in the losses, particularly of World War I. About 100,000 Americans lost their lives during World War I in only a year's worth of fighting. Remember, the United States did not enter the war until 1917, and most of the losses came in 1918, a very short space of time. So this was, once again, a reminder of the sacrifice, the loss that Memorial Day is supposed to mean. And World War I also gives us one of the most powerful symbols of Memorial Day in the poppy.
Talk about the poppies.
Okay. In 1915, a Canadian doctor who was serving in the Canadian Army saw the battlefield at Flanders, a terrible battlefield in Belgium near France. And he looked out at this terrible scene of carnage, and there were graves already marked. And he wrote a poem that begins, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row." A powerful image of the poppy growing up, and it became a symbol of the loss, the blood-red poppy, the sacrifice. And an American woman took the idea of that poem, and she started to sell poppies as a way to raise money for the widows and orphans of the Great War. That eventually became a poppy movement, and hence the poppy became the symbol of both Memorial Day and Veterans Day as well. Our Veterans Day in England and elsewhere in Europe is known as Remembrance Day, and the poppies are most prominently displayed there on Remembrance Day, November 11.
And the poppies, the symbol of the American Legion.
That's correct. I remember very well being in school as a child, growing up in Mount Vernon, New York. The veterans would come into our classrooms and sell those little paper poppies. We all brought a quarter in to buy one. It was a ritual. And I would also say on that count, Memorial Day, Decoration Day, when I was a kid, was in many respects more important a civic celebration than the 4th of July because it happened during the school year. And it was a day when school was let out, but not for a holiday. It was let out because the town would have a parade. And all of the schools would participate, and the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts would participate in that parade. So it was very much a more of a civic holiday than the 4th of July, which, simply a celebration with fireworks. So it was very significant in my childhood, especially as I was the child of a World War II veteran. He survived the war, but we grew up with a sense of what the tremendous loss and sacrifice of World War II had meant. Of course, after the Civil War, the Second World War is the most deadly war in American history. Over 400,000 American lives lost. And an interesting note there as well, a reminder that there are many Americans buried in cemeteries around the world, including in Mexico and Italy and France, of course, at Normandy. So this is a reminder of that American lives have been lost all over the world, and that is what we are recognizing on this day.
Yeah, I saw a Memorial Day parade in Florida was canceled this year at the request of local Gold Star families, that's relatives of service members killed in action, because they thought the parade was too celebratory. Well, is it a struggle to hit the right tone, maybe especially this year when there are very recent military deaths in the Iran war and, Iraq and Afghanistan aren't that far in our history, even if other countries have suffered heavier casualties?
That's a really important point, Brian, and I think that for a lot of us, a fundamental meaning of this holiday has been obscured for so long, and certainly even when we have a celebration of Memorial Day, it seems like it's a little bit more patriotism and 4th of July feeling as opposed to this solemnity. I used to live in a small community in upstate, in Vermont, southern Vermont, and they would have a Memorial Day march, very small, solemn march, and it would go from the church to the small graveyard, which also goes back more than 250 years. There are veterans of the Revolution buried there. And it did have more of a solemn feeling as opposed to a celebratory feeling. So I think it's part of the general confusion that people may have about what Memorial Day is supposed to mean. As I said, Lincoln put it best in the Gettysburg Address: we honor those who gave their lives the last full measure of devotion.
A few more minutes with historian Kenneth C. Davis talking about Memorial Day on this Memorial Day. In the intro, I mentioned the concept of grieving for or honoring on Memorial Day civilians who've been killed in war, more than the number of soldiers in some wars, certainly in recent times, and maybe even with the Civil War in mind, be sad for enemy soldiers killed in battle, even if our wars against their countries, or in the case of the Civil War, their states, were just. Most of them are regular people in the armies of the countries they were born into, and they got shot dead or bombed in a war or whatever. Is this a sacrilegious thought?
It's an interesting thought, and I've never given it too much thought before now, but it's an important one. And I remember one of our last presidential candidates who actually wore a uniform, because no presidential candidate since, I think, 2016 has been a veteran. But John McCain, 4 years earlier, certainly was a veteran, of course, veteran who was imprisoned in Vietnam. And I remember him going to Vietnam. And this moment of reconciliation, it's a powerful idea. So I'm not sure that most people would be ready to say oh yes, we should honor those who gave their lives in service to, whether it was Germany or Japan, for instance, in World War II. That might be a bridge too far, to quote a famous World War II title. And I remember, in fact, when Ronald Reagan went to Germany and he visited a cemetery where SS soldiers were interred. And I think it was Elie Wiesel who objected strenuously to the fact that the president was going to honor this place. And he said, that is not your place, Mr. President. So I think that's what you're raising, a very interesting question. And certainly the question of civilians lost in war is even more troubling in some respects. But I think that might be one that most people are not quite ready to accept, perhaps unless we get past a certain level of time.
Before you go, Ken, can I get one thought from you anyway on how this administration has been very focused on how U.S. history is taught and described, with its actions at the Smithsonian and the executive order from last year titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History? To quote from it, rather than fostering unity and a deeper understanding of our shared past, the widespread effort to rewrite history depends on deepens societal divides and fosters a sense of national shame, disregarding the progress America has made and the ideals that continue to inspire millions around the globe, unquote, from the Trump administration. As a historian, how are you feeling about all this?
Well, I wish we had an hour to talk about just that, because it's a critical question. And certainly I've spent most of my professional career, more than 35 years, talking about how we don't know much about history. We don't understand the past. And we've made such enormous strides in the past, let's say 50 years or so, to recognize what has been hidden or obscured in history. The fact that George Washington and other presidents were enslavers, for instance. This was brought out and needed to be brought out. I've certainly done it in my own books because it is part of our history and our shared history. It's not one group's history, it's the entire history. So it's extremely troubling to see that we've taken these, what I consider very, very grievous steps backwards in terms of presenting once more a patriotic kind of bedtime story narrative of American history rather than the real truth, because the real truth shall set us free.
Kenneth C. Davis is the author of the Don't Know Much About History series, the book In the Shadow of Liberty, The Hidden History of Slavery, 4 Presidents and 5 Black Lives, and most recently, The World in Books, 52 Works of Great Short Nonfiction. And we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for helping us observe Memorial Day this year, Ken. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Much more to come. The Brian Lehrer Show team is off for the holiday, but we thought we'd bring you some of our favorite recent segments, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We have New York Times investigative reporter Jodi Kantor with us now. Jodi Kantor broke the Harvey Weinstein story, some of you may remember, with her colleague Megan Twohey back in 2017, which gave maybe the most fuel of anything ever to the Me Too movement. She and Twohey later wrote the book, She Said, about that investigation. But her new book is far from an expose. It's a, quote, slim little statement of faith, she says. For young people starting out in the work world specifically, it's called How to Start Discovering Your Life's Work, and it's out now. She writes, this life stage has never been easy. This era is making it harder. We need to bring you all the help we can. Now, this actually stems from Jodi Kantor being invited to deliver a commencement address at Columbia University. She found herself stuck on some of the questions that many graduates were silently asking, like how is anyone supposed to figure out what to do with their life in this economy, in this generation, in this moment in the world? And the result, based on the speech that she wrote for those new graduates, is this new book. So we'll talk about that, of course. We'll also talk about one of her big stories. Jodi broke the story of the Supreme Court's so-called shadow docket, the cases they take based on the justices' own agendas, not just the cases that come to them up the usual appeals process chain. So, Jodi Kantor, always great to have you on. Welcome back to WNYC.
It's amazing to be back with you, Brian.
Tell us more of the origin story of this book. When was that Columbia commencement speech? And tell us more of why that was a challenge for you.
So this is a real New York story. About a year ago, I got an email from Columbia inviting me to give the undergraduate commencement speech. Obviously, a huge honor, but also, Brian, kind of a bad offer because you remember what was going on at Columbia at the time. I mean, it was just rancor and chaos and unhappiness. And my friends, like my Columbia friends, were like, don't do it. They were like, call in sick. Like, this is a bad idea. You're going to get booed. But something in me was like, give me those kids for 15 minutes. I suspect a lot of your listeners felt the same way. It was just so upsetting to see the depths to which this campus was descending. So I said, okay, great. Like, I'm honored. I'll do it. But I need to spend some time with students first because this is obviously a room I need to read very carefully before I speak. So I get on a Zoom with the students and they ask me an incredible question. I mean, Brian, you and I both love questions, hard questions. Who cares about the easy questions right now,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
There's no point. There's no point. So they say to me, Jodi, how in this crazy environment are we supposed to start and find our life's work? And the question just like totally grips me because I've covered employment my whole career. The Harvey Weinstein story was an employment story, among other things. I've seen the digitization of the workplace, which is now culminating in this AI moment. I saw their crazy circumstances. I mean, these were graduating seniors who had jobs in Columbia labs for the next year, like everything was set. And
Mm.
then the labs are dismantled and there's no job.
Mm.
And they're just experiencing tremendous anxiety about the workforce. And I knew they weren't alone because ever since Megan and I broke the Weinstein story in 2017, we had been invited to a ton of college campuses to talk about journalism, but those turned into conversations about work. And I saw this rising feeling of cynicism and fear about the workplace. And it was generational. I saw it at elite schools like Columbia and Stanford. I saw it at much more humble schools. And there was a common set of fears that I mean, we're really seeing it climax this graduation season. Fear that you're not going to be able to get a job. Fear that even if you get a job, you're not going to be able to afford a decent place to live, either to rent or to buy. Fear that the workplace is a dystopian, exploitative place. And so I felt like I could really work with this material and like I had some answers. And, a commencement speech is a challenge to write in these times, Brian, because you can't be pessimistic. Like if you tell them that everything is bad and that nothing's going to work out, you have
Yeah, you can't do that.
seriously
Right.
failed
You can't
the
do that.
assignment. So I felt like I had like this really rich, juicy challenge, which is like, what do you say given what's going on that can actually be
Right.
encouraging? So after I gave the
Yeah.
speech, it's on YouTube if you're curious. I could not stop writing. I had a lot more to say. And it's not about putting like some positive spin on what's going on now. It's about saying, okay, we know all the bad employment news. We're very familiar with that. The interesting question here is, what does a powerful and productive response to this look like? What is a young person actually supposed to do facing this employment market?
And so, at the core of the guidance you provide in this book, I think it's accurate to say, are two concepts: craft and need. Craft and need. But those are kind of pretty standard and traditional. So, how do they fit into the current environment you were just describing?
What I would say is that they're time tested, and that's a really good thing because we don't know what the workplace is going to look like in 5 or 10 years. I don't trust the prognosticators who are making big claims right now. I think it's going to take time to shake out. And so we need to go with what's going to be really durable. And actually, I think that each of those concepts is like a little countercultural right now, because by craft, I'm saying, what is the special expertise or skill that's going to distinguish you from other people and make you valuable? And craft is something that accumulates over time, right? Like it doesn't look good on social media. It requires real investment over the years. I mean, Brian, look at your craft of hosting this show. It's the culmination of a lifetime of being on the radio. And you know what's so important about craft now is that the job market is cruel. We know that. Any employee can be fired at any time, but your craft is yours. It's yours to keep forever. It's going to mitigate the sense of being disposable or replaceable. Okay, so craft is authority, right? Craft makes you special. Need is propulsion. We think of need as being an altruistic term, but it can apply to business as well. And need is fuel, need is forward motion. The reason I wanted to articulate the concept of need is that I was so sick of seeing these kind of fashions and trends over the thing you're supposed to study. I mean, I've seen it over the course of my whole life. When I was in high school, I'm dating myself, this was back in the 80s. Brian, we were all told that we had to learn Japanese because the Japanese were going to take over the world economy. And if you didn't speak Japanese, you were going to be a loser. You were going to be left behind. Meanwhile, we know what happened to the Japanese stock market, which is that it slumped for 30 years. And then after that, it was learn genetics. And then after that, it was learn Mandarin. And after that, it was computer science. And these are each like great areas of pursuit. There's nothing wrong with them. But are they golden tickets? You know, are they a sure path to success? Absolutely not. I mean, herd conventional wisdom rarely is. And so my challenge on need is to say to young people, what is your own independent assessment of what society is going to need from you over the course of your working years? And part of the reason I'm liking need right now as a way of thinking is that, you know, the terrible message that this moment is sending to young people and all the bad news about what AI is doing to entry level work. People who are graduating, people who are looking for jobs are getting this kind of like message from the discourse that says, you're not needed. That's a terrible message, Brian. It is damaging. It is false. We need the talents and energies of young people. Young workplaces need to be refreshed by young talent or they die. And so I would challenge young people as a way of getting through this moment to think about what could you do that will make you needed.
I do want to make sure we touch on your Supreme Court article. You and your colleague Adam Liptak published confidential memos between Supreme Court justices from back in 2016 that you and Adam say show how, quote, the justices stumbled into a new way of conducting their work in major cases on presidential power, short-circuiting long-standing procedures meant to ensure careful consideration and reasoned opinions. Quoting from your article, what did they do?
Okay, so thank you so much for giving me a chance to explain this. The New York Times published 16 pages of confidential memos by the justices this past weekend. As you say, these are their internal discussions. We're not supposed to see these for generations, but we obtained them and we published them because they show something very important. They show the origins of the shadow docket. The way the Supreme Court usually makes decisions is very careful, very deliberate. It takes a lot of time. There are oral arguments. The justices get together in person to discuss the cases and vote. They do many drafts of opinions. They they're listening. They're listening to oral arguments, they're reading briefs before they make the decision. The shadow docket or the emergency docket, as it's known, is something different. It's really risen in the last 10 years. It's really swelled during that time. And emergency docket decisions are very rushed and very secretive compared to regular ones. They move really fast. They don't contain like the normal time-tested steps in the judicial process. And often the reasoning is secret. A lot of these decisions contain like legal boilerplate and instructions, but no explanation, no rationale. And they're just like a paragraph long, some of these orders. Now, that's very surprising because judges get their authority from writing opinions, right? Like essentially the only form of accountability we have for federal judges and Supreme Court justices is that they explain themselves most of the time in writing. So the question Adam and I started with was, well, how did they start doing business this way? This seems contrary to how a court is supposed to operate, especially the Supreme Court. And so, like, what were they thinking?
And you noted that even as they debated the Obama climate plan's possible burden on the power industry, in the entire chain of correspondence obtained by the Times, not a single justice, conservative or liberal, mentioned the dangers of a warming planet as one of the possible harms the court should consider. Wow. What does that tell you?
Correct. Well, the person who, like the kind of justice who emerges most strongly from the memos is Chief Justice John Roberts. And he pushed really hard for the court to stop the Obama plan, even though at the time it was an unprecedented thing for the court to do. When his colleagues raised procedural concerns, he was very dismissive. And then to your point about climate stuff, he was very concerned with what he called irreparable harm to the coal industry and to states for whom this was going to be expensive and he said cumbersome. And neither he nor any of the justices mentioned the harm of a warming planet. And also, given everything that happened afterwards, this very rushed 5-day long process essentially becomes the beginning of the end of the federal effort to regulate greenhouse gases.
Of course, a purist would say it's not the Supreme Court's job to navigate the science of global warming and decide what proper policy should be. It's their job to interpret the Constitution, and those policies are up to lawmakers.
Well, in this case, so let's be fair to the conservative justices because President Obama was using a risky strategy. He couldn't get anything through Congress. He had failed. It was the end of his presidency. So he was trying to use a regulation to transform the power industry. And he was relying on a pretty obscure provision of the Clean Air Act. So there was absolutely a real legal question about whether this Obama plan was lawful or not. The real question here is why the court decided this in such a rushed and secretive
Right,
fashion, because
right.
the Obama plan wasn't even going to go into effect for years. And so, why do this in a 5-day sprint in which you're not explaining anything to the
Here,
public?
here's a question relevant to your book from a listener, and then we're out of time. Listener writes, as someone who graduated college almost 4 years ago, I am so grateful for Jodi's words. The message truly has been that we are unwanted, and that if one can't quickly summarize their talents into something that's easily digested by an ATS, then those skills are worthless. I'm currently looking for a job, and it's been a slog to put in genuine effort for applications and to usually hear back nothing. In 30 seconds or so, what do you say to that listener who's been out of college 4 years?
Oh man, I'm glad you called. I feel you. I am so sorry it's been so hard. And you are making a point that everybody needs to hear, which is that applying for a job has changed. It has become digital, Brian, and it has become lonely. People like our caller are being interviewed by AI. some of the time, and not even by real people. I'm hearing of students who are putting a lot of efforts into job applications and not even getting rejection letters. And so this is the hiring market is soft, as you know, but there's another problem, which is that this is a demoralizing, degrading landscape in which to apply for a job. And
10
what I would
seconds.
say is that we need to respond with a lot of human support and networking for these job seekers.
Can't do it alone in the era of isolation. Jodi Kantor, New York Times investigative reporter. Her new book out now is How to Start Discovering Your Life's Work. Jodi, thanks for sharing all your reporting and your writing with us.
Oh, it's so great to be with you. Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More to come. It's a Best of Brian Lehrer show on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page is out with a new book on how Queen Elizabeth II interacted with American presidents throughout the decades from Truman all the way to Trump. She joins us now to talk about her new book, The Queen and Her Presidents. Susan, welcome back to the show, and congratulations on the new book.
Hey, Brian, it's great to be back with you. You know, I've written 4 books, and I've done your show for all 4 of them.
Because they've all been so good about Barbara Bush, Nancy Pelosi, Barbara Walters, and now Queen Elizabeth II. So you have a lane here, Susan, don't you, which is powerful women of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Powerful women who have been underestimated.
Do you think Queen Elizabeth II was underestimated?
Oh, absolutely.
For example?
For example, you know, I think the impression that a lot of Americans have of Queen Elizabeth is of a kind of stoic figure in a colorful hat standing on a balcony and waving. But Queen Elizabeth was quite a deft diplomat, and she was a smart politician, and she was a very shrewd judge of character, and she had a sense of humor, and she was a mimic. She had an impact on the things that happened between the United States and Great Britain. She had an impact, in some cases, on things that happened in the world in ways that I think have been underestimated, in part because it's all soft power exercised behind the scenes.
I mentioned Truman to Trump as the basic arc of your book, but you open with a scene most Americans probably don't know about, FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt hosting Elizabeth's parents at Hyde Park in 1939, serving hot dogs and refried beans to a king and queen on the eve of World War II. Describe that refried scene.
Yeah, amazing. And the first time a British monarch had stepped foot on American soil, because as it turns out, there is even to this day a little resentment, it turns, on the other side of the Atlantic about that revolution. Remember the No Kings Revolution in 1776? So this was a very big deal when the king and queen came over, not only because it indicated the hard feelings over that were over, but also that there was this new relationship developing between Britain, which had ruled with the empire, and the United States, which was the new global power, and the special relationship that they would forge to fight Nazi Germany.
And you're right that the teenage Princess Elizabeth absorbed a template from that visit that shaped the rest of her life. So tell us about the significance of that trip and what the Queen, as I guess a girl, teenager, learned.
So she's back in London with her sister and her beloved parents. They were a very close family. They called themselves We Four, just the 4 of them, a very cozy quartet. And she saw the very dutiful attitude that her father took toward his role. You know, he wasn't supposed to be king. Only when his brother abdicated did he become queen and put her in line to become queen. And he approached it with great purpose, and he kind of rose to the occasion as was demanded during World War II. And that was, she had various challenges during her time as monarch. Some of them enormously serious. Think about the Iraq War and the pandemic and the Suez Canal crisis. And there was one challenge after another that she approached with the same kind of sense of purpose that her father did.
Maybe one of the most striking details in the book is about the Queen's access to classified intelligence. You write about how she received copy number 1 of Britain's weekly intelligence summary. She was briefed on nuclear contingency planning for 7 decades, maybe the most well-versed person on the subject, you say, and she saw daily wartime situation reports. Talk about underestimating the Queen if we thought she just waved from balconies. Can you talk about the depth and breadth of her knowledge?
So think about that. There's really no other leader in the world in modern times who reigned for so long in such a serious way. So almost every day she's reading the government documents they sent her. No one in history had the depth of understanding about contingency planning in case of nuclear war, because she was reading about that, dealing with that, having access to the British intelligence, but also, U.S. intelligence traditionally shared. So it's really a perspective that no one else had, and some of it is her perspective on that is a little mysterious because, unfortunately for me, she didn't do interviews. She didn't write a memoir. She did keep a diary her whole life, a diary in pencil that has not been released. And I look forward to the day when perhaps her diary will be released or will be released to historians so we can see what she thought about some of these remarkable things she witnessed.
But when you tell that story of how she got copy number 1 of Britain's weekly intelligence summary, including nuclear stuff and everything else, did it give her some kind of leverage? Is that the right word? Sitting down with any U.S. president? Was there any situation where it became relevant like that?
I wouldn't say leverage. I would say wisdom. It gave her some insights to have. One of the things that I write in the book about how Queen Elizabeth influenced presidents, and she did. But I also write about how presidents influenced Elizabeth. And in her first visit to the United States as queen, she was visiting President Eisenhower in the aftermath of the Suez crisis. And she discovered that he actually wanted to hear her opinion about things. She had been a child when he came to London as the great general in World War II. But as queen, he did not seem, he was respectful of her. He sought out her opinion on Sputnik, which was a big issue of that particular moment, the Soviet space exploration that suddenly seemed to have leaped ahead of the Americans. It was Eisenhower who really taught her that her views would be heard and considered by the person who was at that moment the most powerful person in the world. That was a lesson she never forgot. And she became, I think, circumspect, but also very skilled at exercising influence, even though she obviously couldn't do negotiations. She wasn't passing laws. She couldn't deploy troops. Her power was something more subtle than that.
So that anecdote was about her and Eisenhower. Moving to the next president, you write about a genuinely tense dinner at Buckingham Palace in 1961 where First Lady Jackie Kennedy was privately dismissive of the Queen's dress, the furnishings, even the conversation, while Elizabeth had to bend her own rules on divorce just to let Jackie's sister through the door. But then there's this remarkable moment where Elizabeth lets her guard down and tells Jackie Kennedy, one gets crafty after a while and learns how to save oneself. Why'd you include that? What do you think that exchange reveals?
Isn't that wonderful? And, of course,
Yes.
Anybody who's watched The Crown on Netflix remembers the kind of rivalry between the Queen and Jackie Kennedy. And royal historians who know more than I do say it's overplayed in The Crown, that makes too much of it. But actually, if you look at the photographs of that dinner, the Queen does look kind of dowdy, and Jackie Kennedy looks entirely glamorous. And there was this this odd exchange, or this illuminating exchange, where the Queen says that you will learn to reserve some of yourself just in order to survive all the scrutiny that being a public figure has. And then the next thing that the Queen said as she gave Jackie Kennedy this tour was she showed her a picture of a horse, and she said, a portrait of a horse, and she said, "That's a good horse." And actually, horses became one of the bonds between the two of them because they were both pretty serious horsewomen.
Here are two related texts that have come in from two different listeners. At least they're from two different phone numbers. Listener writes, does your guest author explore in her new book whether Elizabeth and the U.S. presidents discussed reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans/Black people? And another one, has the Queen ever apologized or shown regrets for Britain's colonial past?
I would say not for the colonial past. In one famous speech she gave, marking the U.S. bicentennial, she said Britain hadn't had the wisdom to understand that they needed to let the colonies go. That's not quite expressing regret, but it's sort of acknowledging that independence was not an entirely bad thing for the United States and was perhaps inevitable. The reparations question is an interesting one because Queen Elizabeth was extremely, she was very interested in race relations. She was very close to African leaders. She had an emotional connection with Africa. It was where she was when she learned her father died and she was becoming queen. It was where she was on her 21st birthday when she gave an address to the British people about the life that would follow. And when Barack Obama was elected president, there were those on both sides of the Atlantic who worried that they were not going to hit it off because Obama had no particular orientation toward Europe. His orientation was more toward Asia. He had grown up in Hawaii and in Indonesia. And in addition, the only contact between their two families had been that her colonial government had put his grandfather in jail in Kenya on false charges of treason. So there were those who were concerned that this special relationship was going to have some tough going during the Obama presidency. And that turned out to be entirely wrong. The two of them hit it off from the first time they met. And I think that Obama was second only to Ronald Reagan as a president for whom the Queen had genuine affection. And when Obama came for a state visit, the Queen, as was her habit, had pulled these incredible material from the palace, from the archives. You can imagine the history that the royals have at their command there. And it included things like a letter exchange with Abraham Lincoln and a sympathy note from the then Queen Victoria to Lincoln's widow. I don't know that they ever discussed reparations itself, but that was a general topic on which the Queen had a connection and strong views. Just one more thing, one of the few times the Queen sort of openly differed with her elected prime minister was on the issue of South Africa and apartheid, where she took a different tone entirely from Margaret Thatcher.
Moving from the profound, reparations and colonialism, to the trivial, but really entertaining, the book has some really funny, awkward moments. President Jimmy Carter apparently once kissed Queen Elizabeth on the lips. President Lyndon Johnson essentially stood up the Queen during his presidency. You want to tell any story like that? Do you have a favorite?
So the Carter story is a great story. So Carter's elected. It's his first trip abroad. He's invited to Buckingham Palace for a dinner that included some European leaders. So he is very new to this role as president, and he was also always a man given to less pomp and circumstance, right? So the dinner's over, and he actually you're not supposed to touch royals, right? This is a rule Americans constantly violate, but it is a rule. You're not supposed to touch them. You're not even supposed to shake their hand unless they extend their hand to you. So the dinner is over, and he's saying goodbye, not to the Queen Elizabeth, but to her mother, the Queen Mother. And he leans in to kiss her on the cheek, which, by the way, is not done. And she turns her head, and he kisses her on the lips.
Oh, by accident.
By accident. And she is appalled and tells this story with horror for years to come. And she's at a private dinner, and the Queen Mother would give what she called anti-toasts, which is like reverse toast for people she really doesn't like. And at one of these dinners, it is said, she gave an anti-toast to Idi Amin and Jimmy Carter.
Whoa, that's some coupling that Jimmy Carter would not have liked.
Well,
What's
just one thing.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter denied this story. When the story came to light in his 30th book, which he wrote when he was 90 years old, he said it was the press had made it up. Unfortunately for Jimmy Carter, of course, a man of many achievements, no longer with us, I interviewed his chief of protocol, who was standing next to him at the palace, who saw him kiss the Queen Mother on the lips.
What's an anti-toast? Do you remove your glass from the tip of the other person's?
Maybe you drink more.
Tony in Manhattan has a Queen Elizabeth II anecdote of his own, I think. Hi, Tony. You're on WNYC with Susan Page.
Hi, Brian, and thank you, Susan, also for being there. Yes, a long time ago, I was a lay clerk, that is to say, a man singer in the choir at Canterbury Cathedral. And the Queen came to visit Canterbury Cathedral one day, and the choir sang to her, and through a spokesperson, she let us know that she did not enjoy sitting at the bottom of the stairs in her chair, while the choir sang from the top of the stairs. She didn't like being sung down to. I thought that was rather funny.
That seems ungrateful. I mean, I'm sure you were singing very well, and it was probably very nice.
You end the book in the present with King Charles inviting President Trump for a state dinner at Windsor Castle last year and a trade deal following shortly thereafter. You write that even 2.5 years after her death, Her Majesty's hidden hand was shaping the moment. What did you see happen in that diplomatic exchange that made you think that?
Well, the President Trump, no president adored Queen Elizabeth more than President Trump, and
Really?
no president wanted more to meet her as president and to be honored at a state dinner. That was clearly been one of the greatest highlights for him of his presidency, and that regard he had for her helped facilitate trade talks during Trump's first term. You know, they didn't reach the trade deal they had hoped to reach for other reasons, but the Queen was facilitating getting Great Britain a relatively good deal on tariffs. Not a great deal, but better than others, including other European countries. And that trade deal finally came together under King Charles, but it reflected, in part, the table that she had set for those talks to go forward before her death.
Some might say the British monarchy is in decline. King Charles is much older. He's had cancer. Barbados removed the monarch as head of state in 2021. Several other Caribbean nations like Jamaica, Antigua, the Bahamas, I think also Belize, Grenada, St. Kitts, Nevis, and St. Lucia have indicated they may move toward removing the king as head of state. The world in general is more polarized. There's the whole Andrew thing. Do you think the crown still has the diplomatic weight it had under Queen Elizabeth in a way that means anything?
Well, it's a different world, and I wonder what Queen Elizabeth would make of it, because these were institutions that the monarchy, the U.S. presidency, the special relationship, that meant so much to her, and kind of her father's legacy that she protected and grew. And now I think they're on any number of fronts, they seem in some danger. Charles may have a successful reign, but he can't match his mother's record. She was queen for 70 years, and her kind of link to her people were forged during those terrible days of World War II when her family stayed in London and didn't flee when they could have. So those are assets that Charles doesn't have.
There we leave it with Susan Page, USA Today Washington Bureau Chief, and the author now of The Queen and Her Presidents. Great book, really fun. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Brian.
The Brian Lehrer Show team is off for the holiday, but we thought we'd bring you some of our favorite recent segments, so we won't be taking your calls. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. You know, we spend a lot of time on this show talking about how trauma shows up in people's lives, but there's a specific kind of wound that researchers and clinicians say has been hiding in plain sight for decades. It pertains to war and deaths in war and other things. It's called moral injury, and it doesn't come from what was done to you, but from what you did, what you witnessed, or what you failed to prevent when it cut against the grain of some of your own deepest values. Michael Valdovinos, a clinical psychologist, veteran, and trauma specialist, defines it this way in his new book. He writes, moral injury occurs when we make choices that so violate our conscience and produce such unbearable consequences that we come to see ourselves as irredeemably bad people. Now, that concept was born in the study of veterans, soldiers who came home not just haunted by fear or violence, but by something harder to name, something that sometimes comes from the deaths that they inflict in a war. But Valdovinos argues in his new book, Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt, that this wound isn't confined to the battlefield. Michael Valdovinos joins us now. His book is Moral Injuries, and it's out now. Michael, thank you so much for joining us for this. Welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
And before we get into the book, by way of introduction, you are a clinical psychologist, a trauma specialist, and a veteran who served in Afghanistan. That's an unusual combination of credentials to bring to a single subject. How did those three identities converge into this book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I would say that all of it converged into this book. I think, I write the book from a bipartisan manner, but really trying to not just create a language for folks to sort of name what they might be feeling, but also I try to give real world examples of how my life, both growing up, but also my professional life, examples of moral injury in those contexts and how it showed up for me, how I discovered it, and some strategies about what I did to try to repair myself.
And so you write about arriving in Afghanistan during your service in the military. You write, I naively assumed that the Afghan people welcomed our assistance. I wanted to give my all to our humanitarian mission, and I considered it an added honor to represent my community as one of the few Mexican-American U.S. Air Force officers on base deep in Afghanistan's Parwan province. That pride lasted just 3 days, unquote, from your book. So what happened in those 3 days?
Yeah, so, it was a really interesting sort of development, and it was a little bit of a shock to myself. This is not something I was anticipating because, as you said, I did go to Afghanistan with quite honestly some excitement and enthusiasm. I was, of course, leading a small team of behavioral health experts to uphold the Geneva Conventions as it related to detention operations and interrogation operations following what President Obama, rightfully, I think, said, no more enhanced interrogation techniques. So he wrote that into law. We were there to protect against that. And so I felt proud of the work I was doing. But about 3 days in, what ended up happening for me is I started really trying to reconcile not just what I was doing there as a psychologist beyond what I was trained to do, but more broadly, kind of analyzing the whole campaign about winning hearts and minds. Oddly enough, I remember I brought some binoculars with me, and I could see over the T-walls, which are these big 20, 30-foot concrete walls that are around the base, and where I was sleeping, I was upstairs. I could see over the walls. And as I was looking out into the local villages around Parwan, I could actually see people on motorcycles riding by. I could see people going about their day. It felt like, sort of, a normal environment within this like broader structure of war. And that for me was really, I think, shocking. It kind of shook me in a way where I started to reflect back on my youth in Mexico, going to see my family in rural villages in Michoacan. And I think there was a lot that came up for me there in this idea that I sort of knew that we weren't going to win their hearts and minds. You can't forcefully impose a way of life on people. That generally doesn't work. It's certainly not sustainable. And yet that's exactly what we were doing. Now we, of course, have seen the ramifications of that. But at day 3, knowing that I had to be there for 6 months, that was a really tough pill for me to swallow. And while my job wasn't to convince other people to live the way we do and believe in the things we do, I was part of a larger system that, in effect, that's what was there to do.
So how did that rupture between what you thought you were going there idealistically to do and the realities that you perceived in those first 3 days shape the argument you're making in this book?
Yeah, well, I actually didn't know what was happening. I felt, a bit of depression. I felt anger. I felt resentment. I felt confusion. There were some symptoms of shame and guilt. And I sat with that. So I didn't actually do something about that the 3 days in. I think it might have been at least a few weeks after where I came upon, and I write about this in the book, I came upon a program that was at Parwan to help detainees acclimate outside of detention, where they were taught how to farm. And again, there was this sort of cathartic moment for me where I came upon this. Just imagine a concrete sort of jungle. In the middle, there's this organic, lush garden. I walked by it, and I remember just reflecting sort of, again, what I was doing, what was my mission there? What was the broader mission there? And suddenly there was sort of this rush of emotion that kind of overcame me. That's completely the way that it felt. And it sort of was one of those moments where your life kind of flashes by in a moment, but there's 1,000 sort of thoughts and memories that come through. For me, I sort of felt that was sort of my breaking point. And this is not, this was an accumulation, I think, of moral distress and moral injury throughout my life, which I write about. But it was, I think, that moment that for reasons that, I'm a 4th generation farmer. My parents are migrant farm workers. My father is, there was this moment that for me really sort of, encapsulated this idea of what moral injury is. And so, of course, without knowing what it was, I went back and I started looking it up and doing research on it. And there emerged this term moral injury. And it made a lot of sense to me. I started putting memories to these feelings. I started putting specific periods of my life and what had happened. And that's when I actually started writing the book. I think there's this misconception that perhaps I wrote the book, in the last 6 months, given where the country's at. It actually started when I was deployed over 10 years ago. So again, I think that for me was the catapulting moment that really brought me into this reality that this was something beyond, really my control at that time. And it was affecting my bearing. And I was a U.S. Air Force officer deployed. I had to get my footing and I had to get some understanding about what was happening.
Before we dive even deeper, can you take a step back and give our listeners a working definition of moral injury? I took a stab at it in the intro.
Sure.
But what's the specific difference between moral injury and PTSD? Because I imagine many people assume they're the same thing or that one leads to the other, or just a basic working definition of moral injury.
Yeah. So I think, just simply put, moral injury is a rupture of conscience. It happens when you've done something, when you've witnessed something, or been forced to stay silent about something that cuts against really your deepest values. And it festers as, shame, guilt, anger, a loss of trust in people and institutions around you. So think of it as your body survived, but your conscience is damaged and or hurt. And I think that you ask a great question about the differences, because that's actually a really important reality that a lot of people who are dealing with moral injury often go and get help and then get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's still a lack of awareness amongst clinicians about what moral injury is. And so I would think of it this way. Depression says, I feel worthless. Anxiety says, I'm afraid. And then PTSD says, I can't escape what happened to me. PTSD is fear-based. Moral injury says something different. It says, I am not who I thought I was. That's a completely different wound. It's not necessarily your mood, right? It's not your nervous system per se, it's your conscience. And that's why antidepressants don't seem to be very helpful, because it's a function of emotional dysregulation. You're more morally disoriented. And I think that the only thing that starts to fix that moral disorientation is a moral reckoning.
Is feeling guilty a more common term for the same thing?
Correct.
I didn't expect such a simple answer to my question. Is this the same as feeling guilty? Is it feeling guilty but about like really consequential things?
That's correct. And I would say, just not to oversimplify it, I think it's a combination of guilt and also shame. And, folks often ask me as a clinician, and I'm sure clinicians that are listening would agree that often they have to say, well, how do I know when I actually need to get help? How do I know when it crosses the threshold of, let's say, I saw something happen in my day, throughout my day, and I felt a little guilty about it. I could have done something different. Is that moral injury? The real way to think about this is that when any psychological harm happens or any distress happens, when it starts to impact your ability to carry on in your activities of daily living, that's when you really should start asking yourself the question of whether or not this is something that needs more attention. If it's starting to impact your sleep, if it's starting to impact your ability to concentrate at work, to attend to your family, to give love, receive love, if you're starting to notice, drinking patterns to try to numb what you're feeling, if people are giving you a lot of feedback around maybe a change in mood, that's probably a really good sign that this is it's gone from perhaps some moral distress to a moral injury. And so it's a good marker for trying to figure out the difference between, I would say, day-to-day, feelings of guilt and shame to what I describe in the book as a moral sort of crescendo, which is moral distress that keeps happening to sort of the behemoth of what can be moral injury.
Going back to your first 3 days in Afghanistan and how you described looking over that wall and seeing people going about their business and starting to question, the right versus wrong of what you thought the mission there was. Listener writes, it's not clear why the guest thought that hearts and minds could not be won by seeing people over the wall going about their lives. How is it different from, say, the U.S. Marshall Plan in Japan? What would you say to that listener?
Well, I would say that my experience of winning hearts and minds in Afghanistan, I had some experience and I had some awareness of how the mission was going before I even arrived. I also had psychological training that told me to modify behavior and support people and actually change behavior is not a function necessarily of trying to convince them of deeply held beliefs that they have had for generations and generations and generations, and trying to force that upon folks. And so we knew that it wasn't working well, right? We knew that it was a whack-a-mole. You could help a certain village, a group of people, support some of the efforts you were doing in certain parts of Afghanistan, but I would say across the board, it was not a mission that we knew was not only just going to be effective in the moment, but long term, it wasn't sustainable. So we got to a point where we really all started to feel like what we were doing was just putting a Band-Aid on the issue with no real plan moving forward. And of course, I was just, I was living in a sort of microcosm of that, but more broadly, I was always thinking about what's the broader goal, what's the broader reality of me being here and of us being here. And so that's sort of the how I sort of conceptualized our work and what we were doing there, and how I came to the conclusion, and I wouldn't say I'm alone, but how we came to the conclusion that really the approach that we had gone in there with, and now of course it's no secret, isn't really an effective long-term solution for nation building, for regime change, for long-term sustainable democratic shifts.
When you talk about the difficulty of changing people's values, and I guess you came to think it was wrong, some people may think, well, weren't you trying to change like supporters of the Taliban who didn't think girls should be allowed to go to school?
Yeah, yeah. We actually, we were trying. I wouldn't say me directly. My mission there was very specific, but more broadly, we were trying to provide support for suspected Taliban to think differently about what they were going to do when they left detention, right? The farm was one example of that, right? That was a program that I think on its surface was well-intentioned. It was a means to help folks develop a different set of skills that they could perhaps start a business, that they could, cultivate land and farm and not have to go back into Taliban sort of processes and procedures and oppression of its people. The fact of the matter is, though, that we're talking about really, I think, long-term, foundational, I would argue, harmful practices that folks have had that's part of the culture, right? And so while, yes, I'm sure some of these folks benefited from learning how to farm at scale, the pull to go back into groups like the Taliban was just too strong, and in fact, there was some intel, and we knew that folks were actually going to go right back to doing what they were doing before.
Before we get to some callers, and also you're writing about how to start to heal from moral injury once you recognize it in yourself, you have a striking line about how moral injury can be contagious that I want to make sure to get to, particularly around charged public conflicts. Writing about events like Hamas's attacks on Israel and Israel's attacks on Gaza, you describe how the injury spreads because of, quote, the involvement of supposedly trustworthy authorities, elected officials, peace officers, clergy, judges, doctors, business leaders, who either turn to blind eye, excuse, or actively cover up grave offenses, unquote, from your book. Can you unpack that? How does institutional betrayal turn a public event into a personal wound?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're bringing up a really important point. And I think what I would say to this is, look, moral injury spreads the way cynicism spreads. When you watch someone you respect compromise their values and survive, maybe even get rewarded for it, something shifts. I think you start to wonder if your principles are maybe, naive, if integrity is just a liability, right? And once enough people in an institution start feeling that way, the culture itself becomes the injury. And I think that's when it stops being personal and it starts being systemic. And I think that we're seeing that in real time, almost on a, if not daily, weekly basis.
Michael in Far Rockaway, you're on WNYC. Hi, Michael.
Oh, first of all, thank you. I've been listening to your show. My wife and I are huge fans. We love that you guys share the facts straight as they are.
Thank you very much.
So I am a little, the backstory to me is I joined the Marine Corps in September 2000. I was part of the 15th MEU in 2001 when the towers went down. We were sent right over there. So I've gone through the whole combat tours, and I've been dealt with PTSD, try to learn how to deal with it throughout the years, different techniques. But this is the first time listening on the radio where I've even come across of this moral, it's so new to me that moral injury, I have never even heard of it. And it makes so much sense how it could be so misdiagnosed. I don't even know how to even begin to even spread it to the veteran communities that we always get so misdiagnosed, or, the typical cocktails of medications and stuff like that, that years go by and by. And I mean, there's a reason why our suicide rates are so high, because it's even so many new things that happen, like so many undiagnosed things.
So here we are with two Michaels who are both Afghanistan war veterans. Michael Valdivinos, talk to our caller, Michael.
Yeah, well, thanks for calling, Michael, and appreciate your service, brother. And what I'll tell you is this: look, it's not. Don't feel surprised. Try not to feel surprised, or certainly not. Don't feel surprised about the way that you feel. I think the first thing that I want you to know is that a lot of what people are feeling right now, including yourself, isn't irrational. And I think that's step one. I'm also really glad that you're tuning in, because I think what you can do is you can serve as a force multiplier. Now that you're listening to what we're talking about, now that you have the term in place, I'm sure that you have other veterans that you can reach out to. I'm sure you're in a tight-knit community around folks that you can then start to spread the word about what this is. What I'll also say is there's some good news here for you. The good news is that if you have an ability to seek help at a veterans clinic or hospital, those are actually the few places in the United States where moral injury not only is now recognized, but there is some decent treatment happening. And I talk a little bit about what those treatments are in my book, Michael. But if you have an ability to seek those services, go there and actually talk to them about moral injury. Because again, oftentimes it's just you reaching out and saying, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. I've heard this new term. What services do you have for that? And some of the best work is actually happening at the VA.
No, I completely agree with that. I just have one question. When you say moral injuries are spreadable, what do you mean by that? Like when you see an action, is that, because I always came to the rationalization of like, what I'm doing is survival. I'm trying to survive. So if whatever this man is doing or my brother in arms is doing, I'm going to try to emulate and try to come out of this hellhole that we're in.
Yeah.
So how is that? What do you mean when it's spreadable?
Right. I think that's a great question. So, there's a couple ways to think about it. It's spreadable in the sense that if let's say that, you see something or something happens to you that causes moral distress or moral injury, and you don't act or you don't do anything about it, and other people see it, there is a chance there that can be normalized, right? But that's just a fancy way of saying that it starts to become something that feels normal, right? People go, well, you know what? If Michael didn't do anything about it, it's probably not that important. I probably shouldn't have to have done anything about it either. And if that happens time after time, or it starts happening, then people just start feeling like, hey, you know what? It's not that big a deal to have to do anything about this. The other way to think about this, and maybe this is the way that you're thinking about this, is that if you do take action, whether that's getting help, whether that's intervening, whether that's stepping up or speaking out about some injustice or something that you feel isn't right, and then other people see you doing that, that's something that in psychology we call modeling, right? We do that with kiddos, right? We do that sometimes with family, where we try to model more appropriate behavior, but that also can spread. And in fact, I think that right now what's happening in the United States, that we're hitting a moral reckoning, that where we're starting to see people step up and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to live by my real values. I'm going to live by a North Star. I'm going to try to do the right thing. That's goodness that spreads. And so whether that's in a military community like you, or in a context, or whether that's for civilian folks, it's a good idea because it happens almost, as a consequence of you just stepping up and trying to follow your North Star.
Michael, thank you so much for your call. Good luck to you and your family. And we have a few more minutes with Michael Valdivinos, clinical psychologist, veteran and trauma specialist, and author now of the book, Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt. We have a text that says, I feel guilt and shame for being a bully when in middle school and high school I verbally abused some fellow students. These actions still haunt me. I am 60 years old. And Elizabeth, a retired nurse in Brooklyn, is calling in. Elizabeth, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to your guest. This is so incredibly important, and I think it'll take a while for many of us to unpack all these layers. But I just wanted to say that during the beginning and the height of COVID, I was aware, and I am now very aware, that nurses who took care of patients with COVID, mostly in hospitals, have experienced some of what he's describing. They were not giving the care they knew they were trained to give, and at times they were not providing care. And that was the consequence, one, of this infection, but I also think of the management of the hospital systems in the city. And there is a big disconnect between the people who do the work and the people who run the places. And I think nurses have suffered from this, continued to, and have not received any of the kinds of, for lack of a better word, therapy, treatment, even being able to express verbally what they saw and what happened. So that's it.
What's the failure, though, that you're describing on the part of nurses when they were so overwhelmed, in many cases, with so many patients at once and the risks to themselves? What's the thing that you're describing that led to guilt or shame?
Not caring for people the way they knew they should be, not going to someone who needed someone to come to them, not doing skin care. People were dying at a horrific rate and were deteriorating in ways that we could have done better with. That was not the fault of the nurses. And I think the rest of the population, and it's not their fault either, were clapping at 7 o'clock. There was a parade. No one was fighting extraordinarily hard to get nurses proper protective equipment, and then afterwards to say, we'll give you time off from work to get the needed therapy.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Here's one more text that also applies to the healthcare professions. This says, moral injury has been applied more recently to physicians practicing in the U.S. healthcare system. As a physician myself, I deal with this daily, practicing in a system that does not meet the basic needs of my patients and being a witness to the spiral of economic and health consequences. So as we come toward the end of the segment, Michael, give us a thought on the best methods for healing from one's own moral injuries. You said before that some of the usual medications for depression and such are ineffective in this. We did a segment the other day about President Trump allowing more research into psychedelics. And one of the things that somebody I saw in conjunction with that say was, this could be good for moral injury. They actually cited moral injury. And I wonder if there are cultures or faith traditions that handle moral injury better than Western secular therapeutic culture does. You're a psychologist. So to any of that, as we enter our closing couple of minutes.
Yeah, all great questions. And just to go back really quickly on the comments around nurses and healthcare professionals, I don't want to minimize really the comments that were made, because those are two really important health professions that not only just in COVID, but certainly before and after still experience high rates of moral injury. And so that's, I completely empathize and agree with that. That is a population that is currently being researched that we don't know yet enough about, but that what I think we understand what they have to deal with and the choices they have to make on a daily basis that leads to moral injury.
And this goes to the healing question, too, because both the nurse who called in and the physician who texted put this in a systemic context, right? The text said, practicing in a system that does not meet the basic needs of my patients. And so how does an individual heal from that systemic moral injury that they may feel powerless to change?
Right. Yeah. So, I'll try to answer this as succinctly as possible. And I want to be honest here, because the easy answers actually make it worse. Healing from moral injury isn't about necessarily feeling quote unquote better. It's about becoming someone your conscience can live with again, right? Particularly after somebody has experienced a significant moral injury. And that starts with, naming it correctly. I think that's a big first start. Most people are treating this, as we talked about, like depression or and really aren't getting anywhere because the target is wrong. Then it requires real witness, not venting, not reassurance. Having someone sit with the full weight of what happened without minimizing it is really, really, really important. So premature reassurance, sort of like you did the best you could, can actually deepen the wound.
Huh.
And I think then comes accountability without this idea of like self-destruction, being able to say, I did this, it caused harm, and I am still capable of acting rightly is really, really important. And then finally, action, right? Our conscious needs evidence that we're still capable of acting according to our values, that we can seek amends, that we can advocate, that we can bear witness, something real. I'll leave you guys with this, that, there isn't a single dedicated moral injury clinic yet. There's some great work coming out of, Boston VA, and I write about some of these treatments in my work in these places. Harvard has a great center where they approach this from an angle of spirituality and religion. But I think typically folks get treatment in settings that already handle trauma and complex psychological stress. So that includes outpatient mental health practices, integrated behavioral health care settings in the United States, and specialized programs like we talked about at the VA. And I would advocate for folks to say, look, when you go and seek help for this, ask for treatments like cognitive processing therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. Those are evidence-based treatments that have shown sort of good outcomes for moral injury. But I'll leave it that, we still need a lot of research and we still need a lot of advocacy around this. I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Michael Valdovinos, author now of Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt. You've obviously struck a chord with many listeners. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Brian. More
to come on The Brian Lehrer Show. Stay with us. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. There was once a baseball movie called Angels in the Outfield. Well, the New Yorker magazine's review of a new book about the Mets is called Engels in the Outfield. That's Engels as in Marx and Engels. That's because the book isn't purely about baseball, the sport. Maybe call it a people's history of the game and of the Mets as a progressive working class phenomenon. It's called Metropolitans, New York Baseball, Class Struggle, and the People's Team. And I'm joined now by its author, Mets fan, A.M. Andy Gitlitz, who is also an organizer and writer whose focus is on counterculture and radical politics. Andy Gitlitz, welcome to WNYC.
Hey, Brian. First time, long time, as they say on WFAN. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad you're on. And it's not often we see baseball and class struggle paired in a book title, so we'll unpack that a bit. But to be clear, you mean that on several levels, like in their players, their fans, also in their place in the sport, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I tried to write really a thorough class history of baseball that would appeal not only to Mets fans and baseball fans, but to people who are just interested in the history of American class struggle in general. And I thought, as a Mets fan, the Mets would be a particularly fun way to tell that story.
Yeah, and we'll get more specifically to the Mets, but I want you to do a little bit of the prehistory and the biggest picture, because you cite a historian who saw the origins of professional sports coming from the same revolutionary forces as the mid-19th century Marx and Engels movement. What?
Yeah. So that was C.L.R. James, who was a communist militant. And a lot of people in his movement didn't appreciate that he was interested in sports. But he was a Trinidadian cricket player, actually. And he saw in the way that cricket was so popular in Trinidad that there was something about sports that really unified people beyond the spectacular nature of it. So I wanted to tell that story a bit with baseball, and through studying the origins of the sport to try to get this political backstory of what makes the Mets so special, I found that baseball was actually invented by New York's middle class in the 1830s and 40s. And following C.L.R. James, I tried to understand baseball as sort of this representation of the middle class worldview of sort of being stuck in between the worlds of the elite above and the proletariat below, and understanding baseball as sort of like a political theater of this kind of maybe microcosm of the social factory. And that became all the more obvious as baseball professionalized after the Civil War, when you start having professional worker athletes taking to the diamond, and really it becoming both literally and figuratively a workplace struggle.
So to the Mets, I know from the book, and I didn't realize it before, that this isn't the first iteration of a team called the Mets. There was the Metropolitans. But let's start with the origin of the Mets in 1962 and how their start fits into your analysis. Where would you begin with that?
Yeah, well, so the first part of the book, I also talk about the great people's teams that preceded the '62 Mets, the Giants, the Yankees, and the Dodgers, and then, as you mentioned, the 1880 Metropolitans. And I argue that there's actually a through line between the two, because the 1880 Metropolitans were funded by Tammany Hall as a working class team, against this other team called the Gothams. The two merged and became the Giants, actually. And so, in 1957, you see the Giants and the Dodgers leaving New York for California. And I think this was a really political crisis in New York, because like many of the runaway factories and the white flight and the vanishing tax base, those teams leaving really revealed that New York City was deindustrializing and entering a social crisis. And this is when people like Robert Moses, Mayor Wagner, city lawyer William Shea, and Branch Rickey, the former owner of the Dodgers, sprung into action to desperately try and bring a National League team back to New York. And it wasn't an easy task. Major League Baseball didn't necessarily want this to happen, but through the creation of this rogue Continental League, or the threat of the creation of this league, they were able to bring the Mets back to New York. And it was also a really important part of Robert Moses's envisioning of restructuring New York between the city and the suburb. And that's why what would be called Shea Stadium, this municipal ballpark, was built in Flushing, Queens.
Who was Shea?
Shea was a city lawyer. He was something of a fixer. He had worked for Tammany previously, in the Tammany-run bank that owned the Dodgers. And so he was kind of the guy who understood how the baseball world worked. And so he, along with Branch Rickey, were able to kind of organize things from the city bureaucratic level within the political machine, and also understanding how the major league owners worked and thought to make this scheme come to fruition.
You write in the intro that the Mets debuted in 1962 as one of the sole survivors of a politically progressive war on baseball. What did you mean by a politically progressive war on baseball?
Well, Branch Rickey, of course, was probably most famous for integrating baseball in 1947 with the signing of Jackie Robinson. And so, although he was a very conservative figure, and economically speaking, he was very progressive. And he believed that in 1957, not only the loss of the Dodgers and the Giants to the West Coast, but also the shrinking of the minor leagues and the shrinking of the prestige of baseball in general compared to the more telegenic sport of football, which Branch Rickey didn't particularly like because he thought it was very militaristic, was really harming both baseball's reputation and the reputation of the United States. He wanted the Continental League, which ended up birthing the Mets, to be international, to be far more diverse, and to make baseball sort of he called it the potential international peacemaker, that actually wars could be settled, or the United States foreign policy interests could be pursued through spreading baseball across the world. And so when the Mets actually become a National League team again, although his Continental League was defeated, he tried to bring some of those ideas into baseball through the Mets, including a pooled player production system, a communal player production system. He also wanted the Mets to use a lot of the kind of theatrics and novel attractions that made the Negro Leagues popular as the Negro Leagues were dying out, because he knew that the Mets would be a really bad team for their first few years, and so he knew that they needed to attract fans very quickly.
And let's get to the Mets versus Yankees thing. in the sort of class or political context. I guess there was, is or was anyway, I don't know about now, with billionaire Steve Cohen owning the team, but there was this idea of the Mets as a team for the workers and middle class versus the guy wearing pinstripes of all things, right? That what that uniform design signified, pinstripes in the Bronx. And Jenny in Brooklyn has a Yankees-Mets call in this context. Jenny, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, yes. Thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm just calling because my father had this exact idea. He's no longer alive. He was a very, well, I wouldn't say a lifetime Mets fan because he was actually a Dodgers fan first. He was from Albany. He would come down to Brooklyn to see games, but then became a Mets fan after they moved to the West Coast. And he always said that the Mets were Democrats and the Yankees were Republicans. So we saw, like you said, the Yankees were very corporate. They were spending a lot of money on their players. The Mets now do, but they didn't always. And as you also said, we were always the underdogs, and they always said we had to root for the underdogs. So,
Jenny,
and I come from a very left-leaning family. So.
Thank you for calling us. How do you go to Mets Yankees in a political context in your book?
Yeah, I think Jenny really nailed it. When the Mets started in '62, they really replicated the enthusiasm for Kennedy in his early years. Kennedy believed in the youth of America, and Casey Stengel, the first manager of the Mets, also called the young players on the team the youth of America. And the '60s Mets really seemed like the team of the moment. They had these kind of pop art-inspired uniforms, these comic book aesthetics. The freewheeling rants of Casey was particularly appealing to the beatniks, and the youth energy at the Polo Grounds was really reminiscent of the folk riot in Washington Square Park in 1961. And as the decade went along, and that sort of youth movement became more and more political, the so-called new breed of early Mets fans and sports writers and players themselves really merged with the new left. So, for example, in 1964, a lot of Mets fans are involved in the civil rights movement, including Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who were murdered in Mississippi along with James Chaney. And players themselves were part of the civil rights movement, like Elio Chacon and Cleon Jones. They had a sit-in, SNC-inspired sit-in at a restaurant in Florida. And moving forward to '68, the Mets were one of the teams that refused to play before the funeral of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, and that made them really recognized as a political team, which was a curious thing at the time. But the peak of this came in 1969 when, as the Mets were making this miraculous run to the World Series, Tom Seaver actually dedicated their potential World Series victory to stopping the war in Vietnam. And
wow.
That's something that's really incredible to think of any athlete doing. Of course, Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had taken a lot of heat by being outspoken, but in terms of a baseball player or a white athlete, it was really unprecedented, and it's hard to even imagine that happening today. But with a book like this, I like to think that maybe we can inspire athletes to be more outspoken.
Jesse in Brooklyn is going to continue down that Mets-Yankees road. Jesse, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. I am a huge Mets fan, and I grew up in New York City. My parents were not super into sports, but my brother's godfathers were, and they're gay men, married, and they always told us that the Mets was the queer team to support, and as a queer person today, I completely agree with that still. I feel like there's so many gay and trans people who are Mets fans. Definitely not everyone. There's some conservative Mets fans for sure, but I love that about the team, and specifically Lindor and Katya Lindor, his wife, are, I think, really wonderful progressive celebrities to follow and support and get inspired by. So, yeah.
Jesse, thank you. Yeah, she brought up a couple of things worth talking about there. One, didn't you have something on the Mets and Pride Night in the book, right?
Yeah, I actually dedicate a lengthy chapter, the epilogue of the book, to the 2024 Mets, which were known as variations on the OMG gay grimace Mets. And that's because they really started the season very poorly. It was looking like not a good year. It was supposed to be a rebuilding year anyway. But until Pride Month, Pride Month is when they really turned it around, and this is when Grimace throws out the first pitch. This is when the team starts singing along to Iglesias's "OMG" song. But it's also a month when a lot of people are attacking the Mets because they're one of the teams that are show the most pride during Pride Month. And remarkably, the players themselves seem to really enjoy this meme too, and so the team turns it around during this month. I mean, there's a lot of reasons besides these kind of mimetic things, but it seemed like this energy that was really a kind of communion between the progressive nature of the Mets, appreciation of the queer fans that the caller was talking about, and the idea that, as J.D. Martinez put it after their closed clubhouse meeting, they said, you know what, we're going to go out there and we're going to have fun. And if we suck, we suck. We're going to go out there and we're going to have fun sucking. And I think that really summarized the kind of energy of the 2024 when, you know, in election season, facing down the catastrophe that could have been, there was this moment when Harris replaces Biden that, okay, maybe something better is possible. Maybe whimsy and joy can defeat this this disturbing moment that's coming. Yes. And they made it pretty far. They made it to the NLCS, but they didn't make it all the way.
I'll give you a somewhat contrarian take on dismissing the Yankees in a class consciousness way. But by the 70s, obviously everything that you said about the 1960s is true, but by the 70s, the Bronx is burning, as they said. And for decades after that, you know, if you followed both teams here in the city, it could feel like the Mets were the suburban team out there in eastern Queens with a big Long Island fan base. The edgier political thing maybe was to keep going to the Bronx to see the Yankees, walk around the Bronx, you know, even as I do today. I live, you know, very close to the Bronx. I do a lot of things in the Bronx. And you see that Yankee hats that the Black and Latino local residents are wearing in great numbers. And we have the history of Bronx Borough President Fernando Ferrer having to resist the plan by Mayor Giuliani in the 90s to move Yankee Stadium to the west side of Manhattan and abandon the working class Bronx and the poor, low-income Bronx. So I can make a Yankees class consciousness argument, too. Do you buy it?
Yeah, absolutely. Jason Buford actually wrote a really great piece about this because there's been a lot of discourse over the weekend over Mets and Yankees and which is the real working class team. And basically my book argues that baseball is a middle-class sport, and so the majority of baseball fans tend to be from the middle class. But the Yankees and Mets, as this sort of dialectical foil, point to two different approaches of the baseball fan. One tends to be more from the perspective of the boss, right? Steinbrenner. Right. Having these roll calls where the players need to acknowledge themselves and like arguing that a player needs to be fired if they're going through a slump or something. I think the Mets tends to be more from the perspective of the worker, and we're kind of all in it together, and we don't really expect the greatness and the glory and the trophies. Of course, you know, realistically, both fan bases, I think, are maybe not so demographically different, but it is very interesting the way the kind of aesthetics and cultural lines seem like such a important divider. And I'll just add to that, and this is obviously a much longer discussion, that anyone who spent some time over in the last few years from that strip from South Brooklyn to Astoria that's called the Commie Corridor, you know, this is the bastion of support for Zoran Mamdani. I think you'll see a lot more Mets hats than Yankees hats there. And of course, you know, this doesn't necessarily mean that people in the South Bronx who love the Yankees aren't working class, but the Zoran is a Mets fan and he hates the Yankees, so that adds a little flavor to the argument.
So in our last 20 seconds or so, do you have anything on this clubhouse drama where, one of the Mets' biggest stars, Francisco Lindor, his wife was involved in some way with the Mamdani campaign, and apparently some of the other players didn't like that?
Well, I don't really know too much about it. This is something that Mike Francesa had heard, that they're part of the problem of last year. 2025 was a really humiliating season. Something definitely went wrong, and Mike Francesa thinks that might be because some players were Trump supporters and some might have been more to the left. And we'll see if maybe that can be corrected this year.
Andy Gitlitz, author of Metropolitans, New York Baseball, Class Struggle, and The People's Team. Good luck this season. Hope you enjoy the ride, no matter who you're rooting for, and thanks for sharing this interesting book with us.
Thanks, Brian. Let's go, Mets.
That's the Brian Lehrer Show for this Memorial Day. Thank you for joining us. The Brian Lehrer Show is produced by Lisa Allison, Mary Croak, Amina Cerna, Carl Boisrond, and Esperanza Rosenbaum. Our interns this spring are Arlo Bivens and Jack Walker. Zach Goddard-Cohen produces our daily politics podcast. Megan Ryan is the head of live radio. Juliana Fonda and Milton Ruiz at the audio controls most days. Stay tuned for all of it.
WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com. WNYC Studios is supported by AT&T. Summer, it's when we share more time, more memories, and more photos. And at AT&T, the iPhone 17 Pro is your summer essential. Its center stage front camera auto-adjusts the frame to fit everyone into group selfies. Right now at AT&T, ask how you can get iPhone 17 Pro on them with eligible iPhone trade-in any condition. Requires trade-in of iPhone 15 Plus or higher, excluding iPhone 16e and 17e. Requires eligible plan. Terms and restrictions apply. Subject to change. Visit att.com/iPhone or visit an AT&T store for details.